friends, welcome back. I'm Christina, the manager at the Pacific Beach Library. Thank you for joining me for lucky day 13 of Roughing It by Mark Twain. Whew, let's see. We've got some good reading ahead of us, and in fact, tomorrow, well, I'm just gonna let you know, tomorrow we have a relatively short reading because we are going to read only 2 chapters tomorrow. It's like one of the longest chapters, or it is the longest chapter of our book we'll read tomorrow. And today we're only reading 3 chapters because they're kind of a medium to longish length. So let's start out with some tea. I think that'll be delicious to help fortify us. My tea that I'm having is a loose leaf tea. It's the Blue Lady Grey, or as I said before, in honor of our reading of Roughing It by Mark Twain, instead of calling it a refined English tea, we're gonna call it the Little Lady Blue, Little Blue Lady Grey. Kind of country if we can. Delicious. All right, so let's go ahead and start by talking about what we read yesterday. I cannot believe how far along we are in our book. We are more than halfway now, and yeah, it's kind of exciting. There's 79 chapters in the book. I estimate we're going to finish on April 22nd, which will be our 22nd day of reading also. So we've got just a little more than 2 weeks left. And actually, starting after this week, I think I'm going to open up the polls so we can start voting again on what we'll read next. So if you want to start thinking about it now, it is never too early to think about what we'll read next, even as we're enjoying this one and coming to the conclusion. All right, so let's start by talking about chapters 43 to 46 of Roughing It. Where we had ended the previous day's readings was, he had earned and then lost $1 million in his mine. And then he had taken a job working for a newspaper where he had talked about how he was embellishing on the truth, shall we say. And so in chapter 43, he talks a bit more about the newspaper business. And he says, as he got better acquainted with things, he didn't have to use his fancy so much to fill up the text, to fill up the columns of his paper. And in fact, he tells some fun stories about what it was like writing the paper, some interesting shenanigans he got up to with some other gentlemen there. And then he also talks about his pay and how the pay was $40 a week, but he didn't really care or bother with it because there was so much money floating around because the silver had come in the Nevada territory, that it was Silverland is what they were calling it. The Comstock load had come in, that there was so much money flowing, that so many people, whereas previously they had the thought of wealth and the promise of wealth, there was still that promise of wealth, but there was actual wealth too. And so he was just saying it was amazing. Like so many people, especially as a newspaper man, they would want him to write about their new mine and to talk about it. In exchange for writing about it, they would gift him some feet, so basically some rights to a portion of the mine and what was mined from it. Likewise, too, he said it became a custom just that people would give away to anyone they met, like some feet in their mines, because everybody had mines and everybody had rights in it. And so, it's just there was so much money flowing that he didn't even have to bother to cash a paycheck because, he just had so much money. Everyone did. And then, in fact, he tells some stories, too, about some instances about how much money there was and just how free people were with their dollars, that they were having so much trouble trying to spend it fast enough because there was no way to spend it as quickly as they were making it. And it's like, unfortunately, these times didn't last, but while they did, it was great. And so one of the stories he tells is about a gentleman in Austin who was running for position and he didn't get it. He lost. And he said, if I lose, he and his opponent had said, whoever loses this election would carry a sack of flour and carry it to their home. And then, it's sort of like he lost the bet, and so he carried it from Lower Austin to Upper Austin. And then when he got there, somebody said, well, what are you going to do with that flour? And he's like, well, I'm just going to sell it to the highest bidder for the sanitary fund. So like a fund to benefit for the public good. I think it was something to do with the veterans. And so they end up selling this bag of flour. And then when the one man buys it, he says, what are you going to do with it? And they said, I'm not going to use it. Sell it again. And so they auction the same bag of flour off many, many times, to the point that this one bag of flour it goes from Austin over to visit them in Virginia, where Mark Twain was living at the time. Then it goes to another city, It goes to San Francisco. It goes to the East Coast. It goes all over. And finally, That bag of flour was sold, it says, for a grand total of $150,000 in greenbacks. Now that would be a ton of money right now for a bag of flour, but think about how much more it was back in 1860. $150,000 being spent on just calling it a bag of flour, but really to be donated by these people to give to this charitable fund. And so it's a lot of money. And again, it says something both about what they were, about the people trying to do something helpful with their money, but also just how much money they had that they could afford to be that magnanimous with it. And so he continues another chapter talking about, how much money people were making, like $6,000, $8,000 a month, $10,000 a month, even $100,000 a year, so much money. And he says the story of a couple folks, like there's these two gentlemen who go to New York City. One is quite unsophisticated, the other more so. And so they, it's kind of cute. The one who's a little unsophisticated says, like, I don't just want to ride in any old carriage, which I thought also was nice too, because he calls a stylish barouche, the first gentleman. And for those of you who read Emma, we know the barouche landau is quite a fancy carriage. But this gentleman, Captain Jack, says, oh no, I don't want that little carriage. I want that big thing over there. And what he's actually pointing at is a public bus. Because he's like, that thing is huge. I want that one. And so he rides around in that. He gives a gold piece to the driver of the bus. And then as more and more people come on, he's just like, wow, these folks are so friendly. Like, I don't mind if they want to ride. I've rented out the carriage, like the big fancy carriage for the whole day. But like, wow, they're just so friendly. They're all just coming onto our carriage. It's a public bus. And granted, he had paid enough in fare to cover all of them for the day, but it's a cute story about these folks from the Nevada Territory who have perhaps a little bit more money than they have, but are still rather naive about how some of these things work. And so it's a good story. All right. Finally, we are to today's reading. I'm going to go ahead and, like I said, we'll read 3 chapters. And I made a note to myself because I did not want to forget to mention this. In one of the chapters, there is a very long footnote. It's sort of like attached to an article that he puts in there. And so I'm just going to let you know when I get to the footnote, I might say footnote, and then I'll try to do my little parentheses hands to let you know that we're reading in a separate section at that point. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Today we have, like I said, 3 chapters, 47 to 49. If you have something to drink, I suggest you take a sip now. It's a perfect time to get settled in and cozy. And let's start with chapter 47 of Roughing It by Mark Twain. Somebody has said that in order to know a community, one must observe the style of its funerals and know what manner of men they bury with most ceremony. I cannot say which class we buried with most éclat in our flesh times, the distinguished public benefactor or the distinguished rough. Possibly the 2 chief grades or grand divisions of society honored their illustrious dead about equally, and hence, no doubt the philosopher I have quoted from would have needed to see 2 representative funerals in Virginia before forming his estimate of the people. There was a grand time over Buck Fanshawe when he died. He was a representative citizen. He had killed his man, not in his own quarrel, it is true, but in defense of a stranger unfairly beset by numbers. He had kept a sumptuous saloon. He had been the proprietor of a dashing helpmeet whom he could have discarded without the formality of a divorce. He had met a high position in the fire department and been a very Warwick in politics. When he died, there was great lamentation throughout the town, but especially in the vast bottom stratum of society. On the inquest, it was shown that Buck Fanshawe, in the delirium of a wasting typhoid fever, had taken arsenic, shot himself through the body, cut his throat, and jumped out of a 4-story window and broken his neck. And after due deliberation, the jury, sad and tearful, but with intelligence unblinded by its sorrow, brought in a verdict of death by the visitation of God. What could the world do without juries? Prodigious preparations were made for the funeral. All the vehicles in town were hired, all the saloons put in mourning, all the municipal and fire company flags hung at half-mast, and all the firemen ordered to muster in uniform and bring their machines duly draped in black. Now, let us remark in parenthesis, as all the peoples of the earth had representative adventurers in the Silverland, and as each adventurer had brought the slang of his nation or his locality with him, the combination made the slang of Nevada the richest and the most infinitely varied and copious that has ever existed anywhere in the world, except perhaps in the mines of California in the early days. Slang was the language of Nevada. It was hard to preach a sermon without it and be understood. Such phrases as, "You bet," "Oh no, I reckon not," "No Irish need apply," and a hundred others became so common as to fall from the lips of a speaker unconsciously, and very often when they did not touch the subject matter under discussion and consequently failed to mean anything. After Buck Fanshaw's inquest, a meeting of the Short-Haired Brotherhood was held, for nothing can be done on the Pacific Coast without a public meeting and an expression of sentiment. Regretful resolutions were passed and various committees appointed. Among others, a committee of one was deputed to call on the minister, a fragile, gentle, spiritual new fledgling from an Eastern theological seminary, and as yet unacquainted with the ways of the mines. The committeeman, Scotty Briggs, made his visit, and in after days it was worth something to hear the minister tell about it. Scotty was a stalwart rough, whose customary suit when on weighty official business, like committee work, was a fire helmet, flaming red flannel shirt, patent leather belt with spanner and revolver attached, coat hung over arm, and pants stuffed into boot tops. He formed something of a contrast to the pale theological student. It is fair to say of Scotty, however, in passing, that he had a warm heart and a strong love for his friends, and never entered into a quarrel when he could reasonably keep out of it. Indeed, it was commonly said that whenever one of Scotty's fights was investigated, it always turned out that it had originally been no affair of his, but that out of native good-heartedness he had dropped in of his own accord to help the man who was getting the worst of it. He and Buck Fanshawe were bosom friends for years, and had often taken adventurous potluck together. On one occasion, they had thrown off their coats and taken the weaker side in a fight among strangers, and after gaining a hard-earned victory, turned and found that the men they were helping had deserted early, and not only that, but had stolen their coats and made off with them. But to return to Scotty's visit to the minister. He was on a sorrowful mission now, and his face was the picture of woe. Being admitted to the presence, he sat down before the clergyman, placed his fire hat on an unfinished manuscript sermon under the minister's nose, took from it a red silk handkerchief, wiped his brow, and heaved a sigh of dismal impressiveness explanatory of his business. He choked and even shed tears, but with an effort he mastered his voice and said in lugubrious tones, "Are you the duck that runs the gospel mill next door?" "Am I the... Pardon me, I believe I do not understand." With another sigh and a half-sob, Scotty rejoined, "Why, you see we are in a bit of trouble, and the boys thought maybe you would give us a lift if we tackle you. That is, if I've got the rights of it, and you are the head clerk of the doxology works next door." "I am the shepherd in charge of a flock whose fold is next door." "The which?" "The spiritual advisor of the little company of believers whose sanctuary adjoins these premises." Scotty scratched his head, reflected a moment, and then said, "You rather hold over me, pard. I reckon I can't call that hand. Ante, and pass the buck." "How? I beg pardon. What did I understand you to say?" "Well, you've rather got the bulge on me. Or maybe we've both got the bulge somehow. You don't smoke me, and I don't smoke you. You see, one of the boys has passed in his cheeks, and we want to give him a good send-off, and so the thing I'm on now is to roust out somebody to jerk a little chin music for us and waltz him through handsome." "My friend, I seem to grow more and more bewildered. Your observations are wholly incomprehensible to me. Cannot you simplify them in some way? At first I thought perhaps I understood you, but I grope now. Would it not expedite matters if you restricted yourself to categorical statements of fact, unencumbered with obstructing accumulations of metaphor and allegory?" Another pause and more reflection. Then said Scotty, "I'll have to pass, I judge." "How?" "You've raised me out, pard." "I still fail to catch your meaning." "Why, that last lead of yourn is too much for me. That's the idea. I can't neither trump nor follow suit." The clergyman sank back in his chair perplexed. Scotty leaned his head on his hand and gave himself up to thought. Presently, his face came up, sorrowful but confident. "I've got it now, so's you can savvy," he said. "What we want is a gospel sharp. See?" "A what?" "Gospel sharp. Parson." "Oh, why did you not say so before? I am a clergyman, a parson." "Now you talk. You see my blind and straddle it like a man. Put it there," extending a brawny paw which closed over the minister's small hand and gave it a shake indicative of fraternal sympathy and fervent gratification. "Now we're all right, pard. Let's start fresh. Don't you mind my snuffling a little, because we're in a power of trouble. You see, one of the boys has gone up the flume." "Gone where?" "Up the flume. Throw it up the sponge, you understand." "Thrown up the sponge?" "Yes. Kick the bucket." "Ah, has departed to that mysterious country from whose bourne no traveler returns." "Reckon. I reckon not. Why, pard, he's dead." "Yes, I understand." "Oh, you do? Well, I thought maybe you might be getting tangled some more. Yes, you see he's dead again." "Again? Why, has he ever been dead before?" "Dead before? No. Do you reckon a man has got as many lives as a cat? But you bet he's awful dead now, poor old boy, and I wish I'd never seen this day. I don't want no better friend than Buck Fanshawe. I knowed him by the back, and when I know a man and like him, I freeze to him. You hear me? Take him all round, pard. There never was a bullier man in the mines. No man ever knowed Buck Fanshawe to go back on a friend. But it's all up, you know. It's all up. It ain't no use. They've scooped him." "Scooped him?" "Yes, death has. Well, we've got to give him up. Yes, indeed. It's a kind of a hard world after all, ain't it? But, pard, he was a rustler. You ought to seen him get started once. He was a bully boy with a glass eye, just spit in his face and give him room according to his strength, and it was just beautiful to see him peel and go in. He was the worst son of a thief that ever drawed breath. Pard, he was on it. He was on it bigger than an Injun." "On it? On what?" "On the shoot. On the shoulder. On the fight, you understand. He didn't give a continental for anybody. Beg your pardon, friend, for coming so near saying a cuss word, but you see, I'm on an awful strain in this palaver on account of having to cramp down and draw everything so mild. But we've got to give him up. There ain't any getting around that, I don't reckon. Now if we can get you to help plant him, preach the funeral discourse, assist at the obsequies." "Obsequies is good. Yes, that's it. That's our little game. We're going to get the thing up regardless, you know. He was always nifty himself, and so you bet you his funeral ain't going to be no slouch. Solid silver doorplate on his coffin, 6 plumes on the horse, and a nigger on the box in a biled shirt and a plug hat. How's that for high? And we'll take care of you, pard. We'll fix you all right. There'll be a courage for you, and whatever you want, you just scape out and we'll tend to it. We got a shebang fixed up for you to stand behind in number 1's house, and don't you be afraid. Just go in and toot your horn if you don't sell a clam. Put Buck through as bully as you can, pard, for anybody that knowed him will tell you he was one of the whitest men that was ever in the mines. You can't draw it too strong. He never could stand it to see things going wrong. He's done more to make this town quiet and peaceable than any man in it. I've seen him lick 4 greasers in 11 minutes myself. If a thing wanted regulating, he warn't a man to go browsing around after somebody to do it, but he would prance in and regulate it himself. He warn't a Catholic. Scasely. He was down on 'em. His word was no Irish need apply. But it didn't make no difference about that when it came down to what a man's rights was, and so when some roughs jumped the Catholic boneyard and started in to stake out town lots in it, he went for 'em, and he cleaned 'em too. I was there, pard, and I seen it myself. That was very well indeed. At least the impulse was, whether the act was strictly defensible or not. Had deceased any religious convictions? That is to say, did he feel a dependence upon or acknowledge allegiance to a higher power? More reflection. I reckon you stumped me again, pard. Could you say it over once more, and say it slow? Well, to simplify it somewhat, was he, or rather, had he ever been connected with any organization sequestered from secular concerns and devoted to self-sacrifice in the interests of morality? All down but 9. Set 'em up on the other alley, pard. What did I understand you to say? Why, you're most too many for me, you know. When you get in with your left, I hunt grass every time. Every time you draw, you fill. But I don't seem to have any luck. Let's have a new deal. How? Begin again? That's it. Very well. Was he a good man and... There, I see it. Don't put up another chip till I look at my hand. A good man, says you? Pard, it ain't no name for it. He was the best man that ever... Pard, you would have doted on that man. He could lamb any galoot of his inches in America. It was him that put down the riot last election before it got a start, and everybody said he was the only man that could have done it. He waltzed in with a spanner in one hand and a trumpet in the other and sent 14 men home on a shutter in less than 3 minutes. He had that riot all broke up and prevented nice before anybody ever got a chance to strike a blow. He was always for peace, and he would have peace. He would not stand disturbances. Pard, he was a great loss to this town. It would please the boys if you could chip in something like that and do him justice. Here once, when the mix got to throwing stones through the Methodist Sunday school windows, Buck Fanshawe, all of his own notion, shut up his saloon and took a couple of 6-shooters and mounted guard over the Sunday school. Says he, no Irish need apply. And they didn't. He was the bulliest man in the mountains, pard. He could run faster, jump higher, hit harder, and hold more Tanglefoot whiskey without spilling it than any man in 17 counties. Put that in, pard. It'll please the boys more than anything you could say. And you can say, pard, that he never shook his mother. Never shook his mother? That's it. Any of the boys will tell you so. Well, but why should he shake her? That's what I say. But some people does. Not people of any repute. Well, some that averages pretty so-so. In my opinion, the man that would offer personal violence to his own mother ought to... Cheese it, pard. You've banked your ball clean outside the string. What I was driving at was that he never throwed off on his mother. Don't you see? No, indeedy. He give her a house to live in town lots, and plenty of money. And he looked after her and took care of her all the time. And when she was down with the smallpox, I'm damned if he didn't set up nights and nuss her himself. Beg your pardon for saying it, but it hopped out too quick for yours truly. You've treated me like a gentleman, pard, and I ain't the man to hurt your feelings intentional. I think you're white. I think you're a square man, pard. I like you, and I'll lick any man that don't. I'll lick him till he can't tell himself from last year's corpse. Put it there. Another fraternal handshake and exit. The obsequies were all that the boys could desire. Such a marvel of funeral pomp had never been seen in Virginia. The plumed horse, the dirge-breathing brass bands, the closed marts of business, the flags drooping at half-mast, the long, plodding procession of uniformed secret societies, military battalions and fire companies, draped engines, carriages of officials, and citizens in vehicles and on foot attracted multitudes of spectators to the sidewalks, roofs, and windows. And for years afterward, the degree of grandeur attained by any civic display in Virginia was determined by comparison with Buck Fanshawe's funeral. Scotty Briggs, as a pallbearer and a mourner, occupied a prominent place at the funeral, and when the sermon was finished and the last sentence of the prayer for the dead man's soul ascended, he responded in a low voice, but with feeling, "Amen. No Irish need apply." As the bulk of the response was without apparent relevancy, it was probably nothing more than a humble tribute to the memory of the friend that was gone, for as Scotty has once said, it was his word. Scotty Briggs, in after days, achieved the distinction of becoming the only convert to religion that was ever gathered from the Virginia roughs, and it transpired that the man who had it in him to espouse the quarrel of the weak out of inborn nobility of spirit was no mean timber whereof to construct a Christian. The making him one did not warp his generosity or diminish his courage. On the contrary, it gave intelligent direction to the one and a broader field to the other. If his Sunday school class progressed faster than the other classes, was it matter for wonder? I think not. He talked to his pioneers small fry in a language they understood. It was my large privilege, a month before he died, to hear him tell the beautiful story of Joseph and his brethren to his class, without looking at the book. I leave it to the reader to fancy what it was like as it fell, riddled with slang from the lips of that grave, earnest teacher, and was listened to by his little learners with a consuming interest that showed that they were as unconscious as he was that any violence was being done to the sacred proprieties. And now, chapter 48. The first 26 graves in the Virginia cemetery were occupied by murdered men. So everybody said, so everybody believed, and so they will always say and believe. The reason why there was so much slaughtering done was that in a new mining district, the rough element predominates and a person is not respected until he has killed his man. That was the very expression used. If an unknown individual arrived, they did not inquire if he was capable, honest, industrious, but had he killed his man? If he had not, he gravitated to his natural and proper position, that of a man of small consequence. If he had, the cordiality of his reception was graduated according to the number of his dead. It was tedious work struggling up to a position of influence with bloodless hands, but when a man came with the blood of half a dozen men on his soul, his worth was recognized at once, and his acquaintance sought. In Nevada for a time, the lawyer, the editor, the banker, the chief desperado, the chief gambler, and the saloon keeper occupied the same level in society, and it was the highest. The cheapest and easiest way to become an influential man and be looked up to by the community at large was to stand behind a bar, wear a clustered diamond pin, and sell whiskey. I am not sure but that the saloon keeper held a shade higher rank than any other member of society. His opinion had weight. It was his privilege to say how the election should go. No great movement could succeed without the countenance and direction of the saloon keepers. It was a high favor when the chief saloon keeper consented to serve in the legislature or the board of aldermen. Youthful ambition hardly aspired so much to the honors of the law or the army and the navy as to the dignity of proprietorship in a saloon. To be a saloon keeper and kill a man was to be illustrious. Hence the reader will not be surprised to learn that more than one man was killed in Nevada under hardly the pretext of provocation. So impatient was the slayer to achieve reputation and throw off the galling sense of being held in indifferent repute by his associates. I knew 2 youths who tried to kill their man for no other reason and got killed themselves for their pains. There goes the man that killed Bill Adams was higher praise and a sweeter sound in the ears of this sort of people than any other speech that admiring lips could utter. The men who murdered Virginia's original 26 cemetery occupants were never punished. Why? Because Alfred the Great, when he invented trial by jury and knew that he had admirably framed it to secure justice in his age of the world, was not aware that in the 19th century, the condition of things would be so entirely changed that unless he rose from the grave and altered the jury plan to meet the emergency, it would prove the most ingenious and infallible agency for defeating justice that human wisdom could contrive. For how could he imagine that we simpletons would go on using his jury plan after circumstances had stripped it of its usefulness, any more than he could imagine that we would go on using his candle clock after we had invented chronometers? In his day, news could not travel fast, and hence he could easily find a jury of honest, intelligent men who had not heard of the case they were called to try. But in our day of telegraphs and newspapers, his plan compels us to swear in juries comprised of fools and rascals, because the system rigidly excludes honest men and men of brains. I remember one of these sorrowful farces. In Virginia, which we call a jury trial, a noted desperado killed Mr. B. a good citizen, in the most wanton and cold-blooded way. Of course, the papers were full of it, and all men capable of reading read about it. And of course, all men not deaf and dumb and idiotic talked about it. A jury list was made out, and Mr. B.L., a prominent banker and a valued citizen, was questioned precisely as he would have been questioned in any court in America. Have you heard of this homicide? Yes. Have you held conversations upon the subject? Yes. Have you formed or expressed opinions about it? Yes. Have you read the newspaper accounts of it? Yes. We do not want to. A minister, intelligent, esteemed, and greatly respected. A merchant of high character and known probity. A mining superintendent of intelligence and unblemished reputation. A quartz mill owner of excellent standing were all questioned in the same way and all set aside. Each said the public talk and the newspaper reports had not so biased his mind, but that sworn testimony would overthrow his previously formed opinions and enable him to render a verdict without prejudice and in accordance with the facts. But of course, such men could not be trusted with the case. Ignoramuses alone could mete out unsullied justice. When the peremptory challenges were all exhausted, a jury of 12 men was impaneled, a jury who swore they had neither heard, read, talked about, nor expressed an opinion concerning a murder which the very cattle in the corrals, the Indians in the sagebrush, and the stones in the streets were cognizant of. It was a jury composed of 2 desperadoes, 2 low beer-house politicians, 3 barkeepers, 2 ranchmen who could not read, and 3 dull, stupid, human donkeys. It actually came out afterward that one of these latter thought that incest and arson were the same thing. The verdict rendered by the jury was not guilty. What else could one expect? The jury system puts a ban upon intelligence and honesty, and a premium upon ignorance, stupidity, and perjury. It is a shame that we must continue to use a worthless system because it was good 1,000 years ago. In this age, when a gentleman of high social standing, intelligence, and probity swears that testimony given under solemn oath will outweigh, with him, street talk and newspaper reports based upon mere hearsay, he is worth 100 jurymen who will swear to their own ignorance and stupidity, and justice would be far safer in his hands than in theirs. Why could not the jury law be so altered as to give men of brains and honesty an equal chance with fools and miscreants? Is it right to show the present favoritism to one class of men and inflict a disability on another in a land whose boast is that all its citizens are free and equal? I am a candidate for the legislature. I desire to tamper with the jury law. I wish to so alter it as to put a premium on intelligence and character and close the jury box against idiots, blacklegs, and people who do not read newspapers. But no doubt I shall be defeated. Every effort I make to save the country misses fire. My idea, when I began this chapter, was to say something about desperadoism in the flush times of Nevada. To attempt a portrayal of that era and that land and leave out the blood and carnage would be like portraying Mormondom and leaving out polygamy. The desperado stalked the streets with a swagger graded according to the number of his homicides, and a nod of recognition from him was sufficient to make a humble admirer happy for the rest of the day. The deference that was paid to a desperado of wide reputation, and who kept his private graveyard, as the phrase went, was marked and cheerfully accorded. When he moved along the sidewalk in his excessively long-tailed frock coat, shiny stamp-toed boots, and with dainty little slouch hat tipped over left eye, the small fry roughs made room for his majesty. When he entered the restaurant, the waiters deserted bankers and merchants to overwhelm him with obsequious service. When he shouldered his way to a bar, the shouldered parties wheeled indignantly, recognized him, and apologized. They got a look in return that froze their marrow, and by that time a curled and breast-pinned barkeeper was beaming over the counter, proud of the established acquaintanceship that permitted such a familiar form of speech as, "How are you, Billy, old fell? Good to see you. What'll you take? The old thing?" The old thing meant his customary drink, of course. The best known names in the territory of Nevada were those belonging to these long-tailed heroes of the revolver. Orators, governors, capitalists, and leaders of the legislature enjoyed a degree of fame, but it seemed local and meager when contrasted with the fame of such men as Sam Brown, Jack Williams, Billy Mulligan, Farmer Pease, Sugarfoot Mike, Pockmarked Jake, Eldorado Johnny, Jack McNabb, Joe McGee, Jack Harris, Six-Fingered Pete, etc., etc. There was a long list of them. They were brave, reckless men and traveled with their lives in their hands. To give them their due, they did their killing principally among themselves and seldom molested peaceable citizens, for they considered it small credit to add to their trophies so cheap a bauble as the death of a man who was not on the shoot, as they phrased it. They killed each other on slight provocation and hoped and expected to be killed themselves, for they held it almost shame to die otherwise than with their boots on, as they expressed it. I remember an instance of a desperado's contempt for such small game as a private citizen's life. I was taking a late supper in a restaurant one night with 2 reporters and a little printer named Brown, for instance. Any name will do. Presently, a stranger with a long-tailed coat on came in, and not noticing Brown's hat, which was lying in a chair, sat down on it. Little Brown sprang up and became abusive in a moment. The stranger smiled, smoothed out the hat, and offered it to Brown with profuse apologies couched in caustic sarcasm, and begged Brown not to destroy him. Brown threw off his coat and challenged the man to a fight, abused him, threatened him, impeached his courage, and urged and even implored him to fight. And in the meantime, the smiling stranger placed himself under our protection in mock distress. But presently he assumed a serious tone and said, "Very well, gentlemen, if we must fight, we must, I suppose. But don't rush into danger and then say I gave you no warning. I am more than a match for all of you when I get started. I will give you proofs, and then if my friend here still insists, I will try to accommodate him." The table we were sitting at was about 5 feet long and unusually cumbersome and heavy. He asked us to put our hands on the dishes and hold them in their places a moment. One of them was a large oval dish with a portly roast on it. Then he sat down, tilted up one end of the table, set 2 of the legs on his knees, took the end of the table between his teeth, took his hands away, and pulled down with his teeth till the table came up to a level position, dishes and all. He said he could lift a keg of nails with his teeth. He picked up a common glass tumbler and bit a semicircle out of it. Then he opened his bosom and showed us a network of knife and bullet scars, showed us more on his arms and face, and said he believed he had bullets enough in his body to make a pig of lead. He was armed to the teeth. He closed with the remark that he was Mr. of Caribou, a celebrated name whereat we shook in our shoes. I would publish the name, but for the suspicion that he might come and carve me. He finally inquired if Brown still thirsted for blood. Brown turned the thing over in his mind a moment and then asked him to supper. With the permission of the reader, I will group together, in the next chapter, some samples of life in our small mountain village in the old days of desperadoism. I was there at the time. The reader will observe peculiarities in our official society, and he will observe also an instance of how, in new countries, murders breed murders. This is the drawing of the man lifting the table with his teeth. We're going to conclude today with chapter 49 with more stories of desperadoism. Chapter 49. An extract or 2 from the newspapers of the day will furnish a photograph that can need no embellishment. Fatal shooting affray. An affray occurred last evening in a billiard saloon on C Street between Deputy Marshal Jack Williams and William Brown, which resulted in the immediate death of the latter. There had been some difficulty between the parties for several months. An inquest was immediately held, and the following testimony adduced. Officer George Birdsall, sworn, says, "I was told William Brown was drunk and was looking for Jack Williams. So soon as I heard that, I started for the parties to prevent a collision. Went into the billiard saloon. Saw Billy Brown running around, saying if anybody had anything against him to show cause. He was talking in a boisterous manner, and Officer Perry took him to the other end of the room to talk to him. Brown came back to me, remarked to me that he thought he was as good as anybody and knew how to take care of himself. He passed by me and went to the bar. Didn't know whether he drank or not. Williams was at the end of the billiard table next to the stairway. Brown, after going to the bar, came back and said he was as good as any man in the world. He had then walked out to the end of the first billiard table from the bar. I moved closer to them, supposing there would be a fight. As Brown drew his pistol, I caught hold of it. He had fired one shot at Williams. Don't know the effect of it. Caught hold of him with one hand and took hold of the pistol and turned it up. Think he fired once after I caught hold of the pistol. I wrenched the pistol from him, walked to the end of the billiard table, and told a party that I had Brown's pistol and to stop shooting. I think 4 shots were fired in all. After walking out, Mr. Foster remarked that Brown was shot dead. Oh, there was no excitement about it. He merely remarked the small circumstance. 4 months later, the following item appeared in the same paper, the Enterprise. In this item, the name of one of the city officers above referred to, Deputy Marshal Jack Williams, occurs again. Robbery and desperate affray. On Tuesday night, a German named Charles Herzl, engineer in a mill at Silver City, came to this place and visited the hurdy-gurdy house on B Street. The music, dancing, and Teutonic maidens awakened memories of Fatherland until our German friend was carried away with rapture. He evidently had money and was spending it freely. Late in the evening, Jack Williams and Andy Blessington invited him downstairs to take a cup of coffee. Williams proposed a game of cards and went upstairs to procure a deck, but not finding any, returned. On the stairway, he met the German, and drawing his pistol, knocked him down and rifled his pockets of some $70. Herzl dared give no alarm, as he was told, with a pistol at his head, if he made any move or exposed them, they would blow his brains out. So effectually was he frightened that he made no complaint until his friends forced him. Yesterday, a warrant was issued, but the culprits had disappeared. This efficient city officer, Jack Williams, had the common reputation of being a burglar, a highwayman, and a desperado. It was said that he had several times drawn his revolver and levied money contributions on citizens at dead of night in the public streets of Virginia. 5 months after the above item appeared, Williams was assassinated while sitting at a card table one night. A gun was thrust through the crack of the door, and Williams dropped from his chair, riddled with balls. It was said at the time that Williams had been for some time aware that a party of his own sort, desperados, had sworn away his life, and it was generally believed among the people that Williams's friends and enemies would make the assassination memorable, and useful too, by a wholesale destruction of each other. Here's the footnote now. However, one prophecy was verified at any rate. It was asserted by the desperados that one of their brethren, Joe McGee, a special policeman, was known to be the conspirator chosen by lot to assassinate Williams, and they also asserted that doom had been pronounced against McGee, and that he would be assassinated in exactly the same manner that had been adopted for the destruction of Williams, a prophecy which came true a year later. After 12 months of distress, for McGee saw a fancied assassin in every man that approached him, he made the last of many efforts to get out of the country unwatched. He went to Carson and sat down in a saloon to wait for the stage. It would leave at 4 a.m. But as the night waned and the crowd thinned, he grew uneasy and told the barkeeper that assassins were on his back. The barkeeper told him to stay in the middle of the room then and not go near the door or the window by the stove. But a fatal fascination seduced him to the neighborhood of the stove every now and then, and repeatedly the barkeeper brought him back to the middle of the room and warned him to remain there. But he could not. At 3 a.m, he again returned to the stove and sat down by a stranger. Before the barkeeper could get to him with another warning whisper, someone outside fired through the window and riddled McGee's breast with slugs, killing him almost instantly. By the same discharge, the stranger at McGee's side also received attentions which proved fatal in the course of 2 or 3 days. It did not so happen, but still, times were not dull during the next 24 hours, for within that time a woman was killed by a pistol shot, a man was brained with a slung shot, and a man named Reader was also disposed of permanently. Some matters in the Enterprise account of the killing of Reader are worth noting, especially the accommodating complacence of a Virginia Justice of the Peace. The italics in the following narrative are mine. More cutting and shooting. The devil seems to have again broken loose in our town. Pistols and guns explode and knives gleam in our streets as in early times. When there has been a long season of quiet, people are slow to wet their hands in blood, but once blood is spilled, cutting and shooting come easy. Night before last, Jack Williams was assassinated, and yesterday forenoon we had more bloody work, growing out of the killing of Williams and on the same street in which he met his death. It appears that Tom Reeder, a friend of Williams, and George Gumbert were talking at the meat market of the latter about the killing of Williams the previous night, when Reeder said it was a most cowardly act to shoot a man in such a way, giving him no show. Gumbert said that Williams had as good a show as he gave Billy Brown, meaning the man killed by Williams last March. Reeder said that it was a damned lie, that Williams had no show at all. At this, Gumbert drew a knife and stabbed Reeder, cutting him in 2 places in the back. One stroke of the knife cut into the sleeve of Reeder's coat and passed downward in a slanting direction through his clothing and entered his body at the small of the back. Another blow struck more squarely and made a much more dangerous wound. Gumbert gave himself up to the officers of justice and was shortly after discharged by Justice Atwill on his own recognizance to appear for trial at 6 o'clock in the evening. In the meantime, Reeder had been taken into the office of Dr. Owens, where his wounds were properly dressed. One of his wounds was considered quite dangerous, and it was thought by many that it would prove fatal. But being considerably under the influence of liquor, Reeder did not feel his wounds as he otherwise would, and he got up and went into the street. He went to the meat market and renewed his quarrel with Gumbert, threatening his life. Friends tried to interfere to put a stop to the quarrel and get the parties away from each other. In the Fashion Saloon, Reeder made threats against the life of Gumbert, saying he would kill him, and it is said that he requested the officers not to arrest Gumbert, as he intended to kill him. After these threats, Gumbert went off and procured a double-barreled shotgun, loaded with buckshot or revolver balls, and went after Reeder. 2 or 3 persons were assisting him along the street, trying to get him home, and had him just in front of the store of Klopstock and Harris when Gumbert came across toward him from the opposite side of the street with his gun. He came up within about 10 or 15 feet of Reeder and called out to those with him to look out, get out of the way, and they had only time to heed the warning when he fired. Reeder was at the time attempting to screen himself behind a large cask, which stood against the awning post of Klopstock and Harris's store. But some of the balls took effect in the lower part of his breast, and he reeled around forward and fell in front of the cask. Gumbert then raised his gun and fired the second barrel, which missed Reeder and entered the ground. At the time that this occurred, there were a great many persons on the street in the vicinity, and a number of them called out to Gumbert when they saw him raise his gun to hold on and don't shoot. The cutting took place about 10 o'clock and the shooting about 12. After the shooting, the street was instantly crowded with the inhabitants of that part of the town, some appearing much excited and laughing, declaring that it looked like the good old times of '60. Marshal Perry and Officer Birdsall were near when the shooting occurred, and Gumbert was immediately arrested and his gun taken from him when he was marched off to jail. Many persons who were attracted to the spot where this bloody work had just taken place looked bewildered and seemed to be asking themselves what was to happen next, appearing in doubt as to whether the killing mania had reached its climax or whether we were to turn in and have a grand killing spree, shooting whoever might have given us offense. It was whispered around that it was not all over yet. 5 or 6 more were to be killed that night. Reeder was taken to the Virginia City Hotel, and doctors called in to examine his wounds. They found that 2 or 3 balls had entered his right side. One of them appeared to have passed through the substance of the lungs, while another passed into the liver. 2 balls were also found to have struck one of his legs. As some of the balls struck the cask, the wounds in Reeder's leg were probably from these, glancing downwards, though they might have been caused by the second shot fired. After being shot, Reeder said when he got on his feet, smiling as he spoke, "It will take better shooting than that to kill me." The doctors consider it almost impossible for him to recover, but as he has an excellent constitution, he may survive, notwithstanding the number and dangerous character of the wounds he has received. The town appears to be perfectly quiet at present, as though the late stormy times had cleared our moral atmosphere. But who can tell in what quarter clouds are lowering or plots ripening? Reeder, or at least what was left of him, survived his wounds 2 days. Nothing was ever done with Gumbert. Trial by jury is the palladium of our liberties. I do not know what a palladium is, having never seen a palladium, but it is a good thing, no doubt, at any rate. Not less than 100 men have been murdered in Nevada. Perhaps I'd be within bounds if I said 300, and as far as I can learn, only 2 persons have suffered the death penalty there. However, 4 or 5 who had no money and no political influence have been punished by imprisonment. One languished in prison as much as 8 months, I think. However, I do not desire to be extravagant. It may have been less. All right. Thank you very much for joining me today for our read aloud from Roughing It by Mark Twain. We had a little look at the lawlessness of old Virginia in the Nevada territory and some of the exploits of the local desperados. So thank you very much for joining me today. I hope you are having a wonderful, wonderful rest of the day, and I will see you tomorrow for the conclusion of this week of reading. Thank you so much, friends. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye.